I just found out my wife is actually my half-sister through my father's affair, and our families have been hiding this secret from us for years. The genetic counselor's hands were perfectly steady as she slid the folder across her desk toward me and Claire, but I noticed she wouldn't make eye contact with either of us. Dr. Melissa Huang had 23 years of experience according to the framed certificates on her wall, which meant she'd delivered terrible news before, but something about the way her jaw tightened told me this was different. The folder was thin, maybe 10 pages, and it sat between us like a bomb waiting to detonate. Claire reached for it first, her wedding ring catching the fluorescent light, and I remembered with sudden painful clarity how I'd slipped that ring onto her finger 4 years ago while promising to love her forever. Dr. Huang cleared her throat softly and said the words that would end our marriage and reshape everything I understood about my family. The coefficient of relationship is 0.25, which indicates a half-sibling relationship. You share approximately 25% of your DNA. I'm very sorry. Claire's hand froze halfway to opening the folder. My vision tunneled until all I could see was that manila edge, that neutral beige color that contained the destruction of my entire world. We'd come to Dr. Huang's office at the fertility clinic for completely routine reasons. Claire and I had been trying to get pregnant for 18 months without success, and our OB/GYN had recommended genetic testing to rule out any hereditary issues that might complicate conception. It was supposed to be a formality, a box to check before moving on to more invasive fertility treatments. We joked about it in the waiting room, speculating about what weird genetic quirks we might discover. Maybe I'm actually royalty, Claire had said with that smile that still made my heart skip. Maybe you're related to Genghis Khan like everyone else. We'd been so light about it, so unconcerned, because we were just two people in love who wanted to start a family. The testing had involved simple blood draws 3 weeks earlier, samples sent to a lab in California for comprehensive analysis. Standard procedure. Except the results had come back flagged for manual review, which led to this emergency appointment on a Thursday morning in October with a genetic counselor who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Claire opened the folder with shaking hands, and I watched her eyes scan the technical language, the charts showing genetic markers, the probability calculations. Her face went from confused to pale to greenish in the span of maybe 10 seconds. "This can't be right," she whispered. "There must be a mistake. We're married. We've been together for 6 years. This is impossible." Dr. Huang's expression held professional sympathy but zero uncertainty. The testing was run twice with independent samples to confirm the results. There's no error. Based on your genetic profiles, you share one biological parent. The most likely scenario, given your ages and family histories, is that you share a father. The words hung in the air like smoke. Share a father. Half-siblings. I felt my stomach drop in that sickening way you feel when an elevator descends too fast. My father was Richard Donovan, a successful commercial real estate developer who'd been married to my mother Patricia for 38 years. Claire's father was supposedly Michael Reeves, an accountant who'd died of a heart attack when Claire was 15. But if we shared a father, then either my dad wasn't who I thought he was, or Claire's dad wasn't who she thought he was, or we'd been lied to our entire lives. I met Claire 6 years ago at a professional conference in Chicago for urban planning and development. I was 26, working as an assistant city planner for Columbus, attending panels about sustainable infrastructure. She was 24, representing an environmental consulting firm based in Cincinnati, giving a presentation about green space integration in commercial developments. We literally bumped into each other at a coffee station between sessions. I turned around with my cup and walked directly into her, splashing lukewarm coffee across both our conference lanyards. We'd both started apologizing at the same time, then laughed at the absurdity, and somehow ended up having lunch together. She had auburn hair that fell in natural waves, green eyes that reflected actual intelligence and humor, and a way of talking about environmental policy that made dry topics feel urgent and alive. I was completely gone within an hour. We lived 3 hours apart, which felt manageable for weekend visits and long phone calls. Our relationship built slowly over 6 months of alternating trips between Columbus and Cincinnati, discovering we had similar values about family and career, similar tastes in food and music, similar hopes for the future. She came from a close-knit family, her mother Diane, her older sister Lauren, and memories of her late father who she described with obvious affection. I came from what seemed like a more distant but stable family, my father Richard with his demanding work schedule, my mother Patricia with her charity committees and book clubs, and me as an only child who'd learned self-sufficiency early. When I introduced Claire to my parents over dinner at their house in the Columbus suburbs, everyone got along politely, if not warmly. My father asked her about her work with his usual detached professionalism. My mother complimented her dress and asked safe questions about her background. Nothing remarkable. Nothing suspicious. When Claire introduced me to her mother Diane at a Sunday brunch in Cincinnati, I'd been more nervous because Claire clearly adored her mom and wanted approval. Diane was warm and welcoming, asking about my career goals and childhood with genuine interest. She'd remarried a few years after Michael's death to a man named Robert, who seemed kind and uninvolved. Lauren, Claire's sister, grilled me with protective big sister intensity, but eventually gave her blessing. Both families attended our wedding 4 years ago, a small ceremony at a vineyard in southern Ohio, with maybe 80 guests total. My parents sat on one side, Claire's family on the other, and everyone smiled for photos that now felt like evidence of an elaborate deception. I remembered my father giving a toast at the reception, something generic about love and partnership, his hand steady on the champagne glass. Had he known then? Had he watched me marry my half-sister and said nothing? If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. Sitting in Dr. Huang's office with the genetic test results burning like acid in my brain, I tried to remember every interaction between my father and Claire's mother. Had they ever met before the wedding? Had they shown any signs of recognition or discomfort? I couldn't recall anything unusual, but I also hadn't been looking for it. Why would I? The idea that my wife might be my sister had literally never crossed my mind because that level of coincidence or conspiracy seemed impossible in real life. Dr. Huang was still talking, explaining something about genetic counseling resources and the importance of not having biological children given the increased risk of recessive genetic disorders. Her voice sounded distant and mechanical. Claire had started crying silently, tears running down her face without sound, and I felt completely disconnected from my body, like I was watching this happen to someone else. We left the clinic without speaking, walking to my car in the parking garage with careful distance between us, not touching. We'd arrived that morning holding hands like we always did, excited and nervous about moving forward with fertility treatments. Now we moved like strangers, like the physical contact we'd shared for 6 years had retroactively become wrong. I drove us back to our house in Columbus, a 3-bedroom Craftsman we'd bought 2 years ago, with plans to fill it with children. The 20-minute drive passed in complete silence except for Claire's occasional shaky breaths as she tried to control her crying. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands locked on the steering wheel and tried very hard not to think about anything at all, because thinking led to implications I couldn't handle yet. Once inside our house, Claire went directly to our bedroom and closed the door. I stood in the kitchen staring at nothing until my legs gave out, and I sat on the floor with my back against the refrigerator. The genetic test results were still in my messenger bag. I pulled them out and read through every page with obsessive focus, looking for some indication of error or ambiguity. There was none. The science was clear and definitive. Claire and I shared 25% of our DNA, concentrated in patterns that indicated a parent-child relationship 1 generation removed. Half-siblings through a shared father. The report included a family tree diagram showing the most likely relationship structure, 2 individuals with 1 common parent and 1 unique parent each. I stared at that diagram until the lines blurred. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother asking if I'd be joining them for dinner on Sunday as usual. The normalcy of the message felt obscene. I didn't respond. Another text arrived 10 minutes later from Claire's mother, Diane, asking how the fertility appointment went and sending heart emojis of support. The cruelty of that message, intentional or not, made me want to throw my phone through a window. Either Diane knew the truth and was performing ignorance, or she genuinely didn't know her daughter had married her half-brother. Both possibilities were intolerable. I needed answers, and I needed them immediately, but I also knew that asking the questions would detonate whatever remained of our families. Claire emerged from the bedroom around 3 p.m., her eyes swollen and red. She sat on the couch at the opposite end from me, maintaining distance. "We need to talk to them," she said, her voice hoarse. "We need to find out who knew what and when they knew it." I nodded agreement. The question was who to confront first and how to approach it. We decided to start with Claire's mother since she was the surviving parent most likely to have answers. Michael Reeves had been dead for 15 years, which meant if he was my biological father, he couldn't explain himself. But Diane would have known about any affair. Diane would have known if her late husband had another child. We called her and asked if we could come down to Cincinnati that evening for an important conversation. She agreed immediately, concerned by the seriousness in Claire's voice, offering to make dinner. Claire told her not to bother, that we just needed to talk. The 2-hour drive to Cincinnati felt like driving to an execution. Diane answered the door with worried confusion on her face, ushering us into her living room where Robert sat reading a newspaper. He excused himself quickly, sensing the tension, disappearing upstairs to give us privacy. We sat across from Diane in chairs that suddenly felt too formal, and Claire pulled out the genetic test results with hands that still shook. "Mom," she said, her voice cracking, "we got our fertility testing results today, and there's something impossible in them. Something that doesn't make any sense unless someone has been lying to us for a very long time." Diane's face showed concern, but not recognition. "What do you mean, honey? What did the tests show?" Claire handed her the folder and watched her mother's face as she read. I watched too, cataloging every micro-expression for signs of guilt or prior knowledge. Diane's confusion seemed genuine as she scanned the first page, her eyebrows drawing together in concentration. Then she hit the summary page with the half-sibling conclusion, and her face went absolutely white. Her hands started shaking so badly the papers rattled. She looked up at Claire with an expression of pure horror. No, this can't be right. This is a mistake. They made a mistake." Claire's voice came out flat and dead. "They ran it twice, Mom. It's not a mistake. We share a father, which means either Dad wasn't my real father, or Richard Donovan isn't his real father, or someone had an affair that resulted in one of us. So I need you to tell me the truth right now. Did Dad have another child we don't know about? Was he having an affair with Patricia Donovan?" The name Patricia Donovan hitting the air seemed to trigger something in Diane. Her face crumpled and she started crying in great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. Oh God. Oh God, I'm so sorry. I thought it was over. I thought it couldn't hurt anyone if no one ever knew. Her admission hit like a physical blow. I felt my chest constrict and my vision narrow. My mother Patricia had an affair with Claire's father, Michael. My wife's father was my father. The room spun slightly and I gripped the armrests of my chair to stay grounded. Claire's voice rose sharply. What are you talking about? What was over? What couldn't hurt anyone? You need to explain everything right now. Diane wiped her eyes and face with shaking hands, leaving mascara smears across her cheeks. Michael had an affair 29 years ago. Before you were born, Claire. It lasted about 6 months. I found out and we almost divorced, but he swore he ended it and begged for another chance. I was pregnant with Lauren and terrified of being a single mother, so I forgave him. We went to counseling. We rebuilt our marriage. He never told me who the woman was and I never asked because I didn't want to know. I just wanted to move past it and keep our family together. I had no idea she got pregnant. No idea there was a child. If I'd known, I don't know what I would have done, but I never would have let this happen. The pieces were assembling into a nightmare picture. Michael Reeves had an affair with my mother Patricia 29 years ago, which was 9 months before I was born. Which meant Michael Reeves was my biological father, not Richard Donovan. Which meant the man I'd called Dad my entire life wasn't actually my father. Which meant Claire and I were half-siblings through Michael. I heard myself ask a question, though my voice sounded strange and distant. Does Richard know? Does the man I call my father know I'm not his biological son? Diane shook her head violently. I don't know. Michael never told me who the woman was. I didn't know it was Patricia until you just said that name. I've never met your parents. I wasn't at your wedding because I had pneumonia that week, remember? I've only seen photos and you never mentioned their full names in conversation. I had no way to connect the dots. This was all buried 30 years ago. Dead and buried. Except it wasn't buried. It was walking around in our DNA, waiting to surface the moment we tried to have children. The cruelty of the timing was almost poetic. We'd been married for 4 years, together for 6, completely in love and unaware that we were committing incest. Now we knew and couldn't unknow it. Claire was still processing, her face cycling through emotions too fast to track. So Dad knew he got someone pregnant during his affair and just never mentioned it? Never tried to find out what happened? Never paid child support or took responsibility? Diane's face twisted with old anger and fresh guilt. He told me he ended it completely. He swore there was no ongoing contact. If he knew about a pregnancy, he never told me. But Michael could be selfish like that, protecting himself above everything else. I'm so sorry, Claire. I'm so sorry to both of you. If I'd known this was possible, I never would have kept the secret. I thought I was protecting our family. The road to hell, right? Paved with good intentions and cowardice. We sat in devastated silence for a long moment, the weight of 3 decades of lies settling over us like ash. Claire finally spoke, her voice hollow. We need to talk to Patricia. We need to know if Richard knows, if he's been raising someone else's child all these years without knowing, or if he's complicit in hiding this. We need to know why Mom kept this secret when she clearly knew I existed. We need answers from everyone involved in this nightmare. I nodded agreement, though the idea of confronting my mother made me feel physically ill. The woman who'd raised me, who'd packed my school lunches and attended my baseball games and helped me move into college dorms, had been hiding that I was the product of an affair my entire life. Had let me believe Richard was my father, had watched me build a relationship with him based on complete fiction. The betrayal felt insurmountable. We drove back to Columbus that night in silence, both too shattered for conversation. I dropped Claire at our house and told her I needed to drive, needed to think, couldn't be in that space yet. She nodded understanding and went inside alone. I drove aimlessly for 2 hours through Columbus suburbs and rural roads, my mind cycling through memories and recontextualizing everything. Every time Richard had seemed distant or critical, every time he'd compared me unfavorably to colleagues' sons or expressed disappointment in my choices. Had he known I wasn't his? Had he resented me for being proof of my mother's infidelity? Or had he genuinely believed I was his son and loved me as best he could within his emotionally limited capacity? The uncertainty was torture. I ended up at a bar I didn't recognize in a strip mall on the east side, ordered whiskey I didn't taste, and sat staring at my phone. I needed to call my parents and demand answers, but I couldn't make myself do it yet. Instead, I pulled up photos from our wedding, swiping through images of Claire and me cutting cake, dancing our first dance, laughing with friends. We'd looked so happy, so innocent, so completely unaware that our union was biologically wrong. I thought about our wedding night, about the 4 years of marriage since, about every intimate moment we'd shared. Had it all been invalidated retroactively? Was our love real if it was built on unknowing incest? The philosophical questions spiraled into dark places I couldn't escape. My phone rang at 11:30 p.m., making me jump. It was Claire. I answered and heard her crying again. I can't sleep in our bed. I can't be in our house. I'm at Lauren's. I just needed you to know where I was. Her sister Lauren lived 20 minutes away in a different Columbus suburb. I told Claire I understood, that I was at a bar drowning my sorrows, but would go to a hotel rather than going home too. She asked which hotel, and I realized I didn't know. Hadn't thought that far ahead. We agreed to talk tomorrow after we'd both had time to process the initial shock. We told each other we loved each other, and the words felt both true and impossible. How do you love someone who's your sister? How do you stop loving someone just because you learned you're related? I checked into a Holiday Inn near the airport, paid cash for a room that smelled like industrial cleaner and other people's lives, and lay on top of the covers staring at the ceiling until pale light started filtering through the curtains. I hadn't slept at all. Around 7 a.m., I texted my mother asking her to meet me for breakfast, just the two of us, urgent. She responded within minutes, agreeing to meet at a diner near their house at 8:30. I showered in the tiny hotel bathroom, put on the same clothes from yesterday, and drove to the diner running on adrenaline and rage. Patricia Donovan arrived exactly on time, looking polished and composed in casual, expensive clothes, her blonde hair styled perfectly despite the early hour. She slid into the booth across from me with a smile that faded when she saw my expression. "What's wrong? You look terrible. Did something happen with Claire?" The mention of Claire's name made my hands curl into fists under the table. I pulled out the genetic test results and slid them across the chipped Formica surface. "You need to read this. All of it. Then you need to tell me the truth about who my father actually is and why you've been lying to me for 28 years. My mother's face went through the same progression Diane's had. Confusion, then comprehension, then horror, then something that might have been shame. She read in silence while I watched, cataloging her reactions like evidence. When she finished, she set the papers down carefully and folded her hands on top of them. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "How did you find out?" The question enraged me. How did I find out? We got genetic testing for fertility treatment and discovered my wife is my half-sister. That's how I found out. The real question is why I had to find out this way instead of being told the truth at literally any point in my entire life. Patricia flinched, but didn't look away. I never meant for this to happen. Michael and I, it was a terrible mistake that ended almost 30 years ago. I thought it was over. I thought no one would ever have to know. The familiarity with which she said Michael's name made me want to vomit. "You had an affair with Claire's father and got pregnant with me. Does Richard know? Does Dad know I'm not his biological son?" My mother's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "Number Richard doesn't know. I found out I was pregnant right after the affair ended. I'd been sleeping with both of them around the same time, so I convinced myself the baby could be Richard's. I chose to believe that because the alternative would have destroyed our marriage and Richard's political aspirations. He was running for city council at the time, positioning himself for bigger things. A scandal would have ruined everything. So you just decided to lie to everyone forever and hoped it would never matter?" I was nearly shouting now, drawing looks from other diner patrons, but I didn't care. "You let me call him Dad. You let him raise me thinking I was his son. You watched me marry my half-sister and said nothing." Patricia was crying openly now, tears running down her carefully made-up face. "I didn't know Claire was Michael's daughter. I didn't know he had other children. He never told me he was married or that his wife was pregnant when we were together. He told me he was divorced and lonely. When I found out the truth later, I was already committed to staying with Richard and raising you as his child. By the time you met Claire, I didn't recognize her mother's name from Michael's obituary years earlier. I never put it together until right now. The layers of deception and willful ignorance were staggering. My mother had convinced herself I was Richard's child, despite having an affair at the exact time of conception. She'd never told Michael Reeves he had a son. She'd let me grow up believing a lie, had watched me fall in love with my half-sister, had attended our wedding and smiled for photos knowing there was at least a possibility this exact scenario could happen. "What about medical history?" I asked, my voice shaking with fury. "What about when doctors asked about paternal health issues, and I gave them Richard's family history instead of Michael's? What if there were genetic conditions I needed to know about? What if Claire and I had gotten pregnant before finding out we're siblings, and our child had serious health problems because of recessive genes? Did you ever think about any of that, or were you just completely focused on protecting yourself?" My mother reached across the table toward my hand, but I pulled back sharply. Don't you dare try to comfort me right now. You don't get to play the loving mother when you've built my entire life on lies." Patricia's hand retreated, and she wrapped both arms around herself defensively. "I made a terrible choice 28 years ago, and I've lived with the guilt every single day. But I did love you and raise you the best I could. I gave you a stable home and good education and tried to be a good mother even while carrying this secret. That has to count for something. It counted for nothing in that moment. The stable home had been built on fraud. The good education had been funded with Richard's money under false pretenses. Her attempts at being a good mother had all included the foundational lie that poisoned everything else. I felt my chest tightening with panic or rage or grief. I couldn't tell which. "I need to know everything," I said, forcing my voice steady. "When exactly was the affair? How long did it last? Did you love him? Did he know you were married? Every single detail. Right now." My mother took a shaky breath and began talking in a flat, confessional tone. "It started at a real estate development conference in Cleveland in March of 1996. Michael Reeves was there representing his accounting firm, I was there with Richard networking for his council campaign. We met at a hotel bar, started talking, had too much to drink. It was supposed to be one night, but then we kept seeing each other over the next few months. He told me he was divorced, and I wanted to believe him because it made what we were doing seem less wrong. The affair lasted about 5 months. Richard was gone constantly with campaign events, and I was lonely and angry about being left alone all the time. Michael made me feel seen in ways Richard never did. Then I found out he was married with a pregnant wife, and I ended it immediately. 2 weeks later, I realized I was pregnant. The timeline aligned with what Diane had said. Michael had been cheating on his pregnant wife while lying to my mother about his marital status. 2 separate families destroyed by one man's selfishness and both women's choices to hide the truth. Did you ever try to tell him about me? I asked. Did Michael Reeves die without knowing he had a son? Patricia shook her head. I wrote him a letter right after you were born. I told him I'd had his child and that I was raising the baby as my husband's, but thought he deserved to know the truth. I sent it to his office address. He never responded. I don't know if he ever got it or if he chose to ignore it. Either way, he made clear he wanted no part of your life, so I moved forward as planned. The cruelty of that rejection, even secondhand, stung. My biological father had known I existed and chose to pretend I didn't. What are you going to tell Richard? I asked. He's going to find out eventually. Claire and I are getting our marriage annulled, obviously, which will raise questions. Are you finally going to tell him the truth or find some new lie to protect yourself? My mother's face crumpled with fresh tears. I don't know. I don't know how to tell him something like this after 28 years of marriage. It will destroy him. Destroy us. Everything we've built will be gone. Good, I said coldly. You deserve to lose everything for what you've done. You've destroyed my marriage, my identity, my relationship with the man I thought was my father, and my wife's mental health. The least you can do is face the consequences of your own choices finally. I stood up from the booth, threw cash on the table for coffee I hadn't touched, and walked out while my mother sat crying into her hands. I drove directly to Richard Donovan's downtown office, a corner suite in a glass tower where his commercial real estate firm operated. His assistant tried to tell me he was in a meeting, but I pushed past her, opened his office door without knocking, and interrupted his conference with 2 clients in expensive suits. I need to talk to you right now, I said, my voice hard enough to cut glass. It's about Mom, and it can't wait. Richard's face showed annoyance shifting to concern. He excused his clients, asking his assistant to reschedule, and closed the door behind them. What's going on? Is your mother okay? I almost laughed at the question. Depended on how you defined okay. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. I handed him the genetic test results without preamble. You need to read this. Then we need to have a conversation about whether you knew I wasn't your biological son or if Mom has been lying to both of us for my entire life. Richard's face went from concerned to confused to shocked as he read. I watched him process the same information everyone else had processed, watched him arrive at the same devastating conclusion. This says you and Claire are half-siblings. This says you share a father. His voice trailed off as the implications hit. I'm not your biological father. The statement hung between us. I kept my voice level with effort. Did you know? Have you known all along that I wasn't yours and just never said anything? Or is this as much a surprise to you as it is to me? Richard sank into his office chair looking 20 years older than he had 5 minutes ago. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know. I knew your mother and I were having problems around the time she got pregnant, but she told me the baby was mine and I never questioned it. You looked enough like my side of the family, or I convinced myself you did. I never had any reason to doubt. The pain in his voice sounded genuine, but I was too angry to care. So Mom has been lying to both of us for 28 years. She had an affair with Michael Reeves, Claire's father, got pregnant with me, and just decided to pass me off as yours without ever telling either of us the truth. And now Claire and I have to get our marriage annulled because we're brother and sister, and everyone who could have prevented this chose to keep their secrets instead. Richard's hands were shaking as he set the test results on his desk. I raised you as my son. I love you as my son. Biology doesn't change that. The words echoed what I'd been trying to tell myself about Claire, but hearing them from Richard felt different. We'd never had an emotionally close relationship. He'd always been distant and critical, more focused on work than family. Part of me had assumed that was just his personality. Now I wondered if some unconscious part of him had sensed I wasn't his and created that distance without knowing why. I don't know what I feel right now, I told him honestly. I don't know if we can maintain a relationship after this. I don't know anything anymore, except that my entire life has been built on lies, and I can't trust anyone. I left his office before he could respond and drove back to the hotel where I'd stayed the previous night. The room was still available, so I extended my stay, paid for another night, and collapsed on the bed. My phone showed missed calls from Claire, from my mother, from Richard, from Claire's mother, Diane. Everyone wanting to talk, to explain, to justify. I turned my phone off and stared at the ceiling, trying to figure out what came next. The legal reality was straightforward enough. Claire and I would need to get our marriage annulled, which in Ohio required proving the marriage was void from the beginning due to incest. We'd have to file paperwork, potentially go to court, explain to a judge why we'd unknowingly married our sibling. The humiliation of that process felt insurmountable. The emotional reality was more complicated. I loved Claire. That hadn't changed with the revelation about our biology. I was in love with my half-sister, which made me feel sick and confused and angry. The relationship had to end, obviously. We couldn't stay married, couldn't continue being romantic partners, couldn't build a life together. But could we stay in each other's lives at all? Could we salvage some kind of relationship as siblings, or would the history of our marriage make that impossible? I didn't know and couldn't begin to process it while still in shock. Around 4 p.m., I turned my phone back on and found 17 missed calls and 34 text messages. Most were from family members, but 3 were from a number I didn't recognize. The voicemails from that number identified the caller as attorney Nina Castellano from a family law firm in Columbus. She'd been recommended by Claire and wanted to discuss our annulment case. I called her back and spoke with a paralegal who scheduled me for a consultation the following day at 10 a.m. I agreed and hung up feeling slightly more grounded. At least there was a path forward legally, even if emotionally, I was completely lost. Claire called at 6 p.m., and I answered because I owed her that much. Her voice sounded as wrecked as I felt. I talked to a lawyer, Nina Castellano. She says annulment cases based on incest are rare but straightforward legally once we provide the genetic evidence. We just have to file jointly and appear before a judge. The marriage will be void retroactively, like it never happened, like we were never married. The phrase "like it never happened" broke something in me. We were married, Claire, for 4 years. That was real, even if it shouldn't have been. I know, she said, crying again. I know it was real. But we can't stay married now. You know we can't. I did know. Knowing didn't make it hurt less. We talked for an hour about logistics and next steps, carefully avoiding any discussion of feelings or the future of our relationship beyond the legal necessities. We agreed to meet with Nina Castellano together to coordinate our stories for the annulment filing, to divide our shared assets amicably. We discussed who would keep the house, whether we'd sell it, or one of us would buy out the other, how to handle joint bank accounts and shared debts. The conversation felt surreal, like planning a divorce, but worse because divorce implied a failed marriage while annulment implied the marriage had never been valid in the first place. Everything we'd built together was being retroactively erased. The meeting with Nina Castellano happened in her downtown office, a space decorated with law books and abstract art that probably cost more than my car. Nina was a woman in her early 50s with steel gray hair and sharp eyes who'd been practicing family law for 26 years, according to her website. She listened to our story without visible reaction, took notes on a yellow legal pad, and asked clinical questions about timelines and documentation. Do you have the genetic test results from the fertility clinic? Yes. Do you have birth certificates showing your listed fathers? Yes. Do you have your marriage license? Yes. Good. This should be straightforward then. Ohio law makes marriages between half-siblings void from inception under revised code section 3101.01. You'll file a complaint for annulment in common pleas court, attach the genetic evidence and birth certificates, and request a hearing. The judge will review the evidence and grant the annulment. The entire process typically takes 4 to 6 weeks. 4 to 6 weeks to erase 4 years of marriage. Claire asked about property division, and Nina explained that even though the marriage would be legally void, Ohio courts could still equitably divide marital assets as if it were a divorce. We'd need to file financial disclosure statements, agree on division of property, and present a settlement agreement for the judge's approval. If we couldn't agree, the court would decide for us, but Nina strongly recommended working it out ourselves to avoid additional legal costs and public proceedings. We assured her we'd cooperate. There was no anger between us, just grief and shock, and the shared trauma of discovering our entire relationship had been built on lies neither of us could have known about. After the meeting, I drove Claire back to Lauren's apartment where she'd been staying. We sat in my car in the parking lot talking about everything and nothing, avoiding the goodbye that felt too permanent. I'm so angry at them, Claire said quietly. At my mom for keeping the affair secret, at your mom for lying about your paternity, at my dad for being a cheating coward who abandoned his own child. They all chose their own comfort over our lives, and now we're the ones paying for it. I felt the same rage, but also a growing determination that they shouldn't escape consequences. Our parents had made choices decades ago that had destroyed our lives now. They should face accountability for that. But how? An idea started forming, reckless and probably vindictive, but satisfying in a way that felt necessary. What if we told everyone? I asked Claire. What if we went public with this story so our parents couldn't hide behind their respectable facades anymore? Let people know what their secrets cost. Make them face social consequences even if there are no legal ones. Claire looked at me with wide eyes. You mean like, tell our friends and extended family? I was thinking bigger, I said. Like media, news coverage, public exposure. Our parents destroyed our lives to protect their reputations. Let's take their reputations away. Claire sat with that for a long moment before slowly nodding. They deserve it. They absolutely deserve it. But are you sure you want our story out there? It's humiliating for us too. I'd considered that. Going public would mean admitting we'd unknowingly married our sibling, which was humiliating, and would invite judgment and mockery. But it would also expose the systematic failures that had led to this situation. Parents who'd hidden affairs and lied about paternity, a system that didn't require genetic screening before marriage licenses were issued, a culture that prioritized reputation over truth. If our story could shine a light on those failures and prevent this from happening to others, maybe the humiliation would be worth it. I'm sure, I told Claire. I want them to face consequences. She agreed, and we shook hands like business partners sealing a deal, the gesture feeling absurdly formal given we were still legally married. I contacted Allison Price, an investigative journalist with the Cleveland Observer who'd done previous reporting on family law issues and genetic testing controversies. I'd found her through online research, reading her articles about paternity fraud and IVF mix-ups and other cases where DNA testing had revealed family secrets. I sent her an email outlining our situation in broad terms and offering an exclusive interview if she was interested. She responded within 2 hours, asking to meet as soon as possible. We scheduled a call for that evening, and I looped Claire in. On the call, Allison listened to our full story, asked probing questions about timelines and evidence, and agreed to write a piece if we'd provide documentation and use our real names. Anonymous stories don't have the same impact, she explained. People need to see real faces and real consequences to care. Claire and I agreed. We'd already lost everything that mattered. Our reputations were the least of our concerns. Over the next week, Allison conducted extensive interviews with both of us, verified our story through court records and the genetic testing documentation, and attempted to contact our parents for comment. My mother, Patricia, refused to speak with her. Richard issued a brief statement through his company's PR team, saying the matter was private and he had no comment. Diane Reeves agreed to a phone interview where she admitted to knowing about Michael's affair, but claimed she'd never known about me specifically or connected me to Claire. All three of them sounded defensive and evasive in ways that made them look worse. Allison also consulted with genetic counselors and family law experts who explained the implications of our case and the gaps in the system that had allowed it to happen. The article published 3 weeks later under the headline, "A Marriage Built on Lies: How Family Secrets Led to Unknowing Incest." Allison had written it with sensitivity and focus, using our story to examine broader issues of paternity deception, the importance of genetic testing, and the need for medical honesty. She included quotes from our interviews, excerpts from the genetic test results, and photos Claire and I had provided from our wedding. The images of us smiling and obviously in love, now labeled as half-siblings who'd unknowingly committed incest, were visceral and heartbreaking. The article went viral within hours of publication. It was shared across social media platforms, picked up by national news outlets, discussed on morning talk shows and evening news broadcasts. People had strong reactions, some sympathetic to our situation, others judgmental about how we'd failed to notice family resemblances, many angry at our parents for the deception. The story sparked debates about mandatory genetic testing before marriage licenses, about statute of limitations for paternity fraud, about parental liability for consequences of hidden affairs. Claire and I became the faces of a conversation we'd never asked to be part of, but we'd chosen this path knowing it would be difficult. The public exposure had consequences for our parents exactly as we'd intended. My mother, Patricia, faced immediate backlash in her social circles. Women from her book club and charity committees distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with someone who'd committed adultery and lied about paternity for decades. Some of her longtime friends defended her, but many quietly stopped including her in events. Richard's business suffered more tangible damage. Several clients pulled their contracts, citing concerns about his judgment and character. His partners at the real estate firm asked him to take a step back from high-profile projects to avoid negative publicity affecting the company. He refused and ended up being forced into early retirement at 56, his career ambitions destroyed by association with my mother's decades-old affair. Diane Reeves faced less severe consequences since she'd been the betrayed wife rather than the cheater, but she still dealt with judgment from her community. Her current husband, Robert, was reportedly furious about the secrets she'd kept and their marriage faced serious strain. Lauren, Claire's sister, stopped speaking to Diane for several months, angry that their mother had known about the affair and never warned Claire before she married me. The fractures in their family relationships mirrored the fractures in mine. The annulment hearing took place 6 weeks after we'd filed the complaint in a common pleas courtroom before Judge Andrew Whitfield. The proceeding was relatively quick and painless legally, though emotionally it was devastating. Nina presented our genetic evidence, our birth certificates, our marriage license, and our settlement agreement dividing assets. The judge reviewed everything with professional detachment and asked us each a few questions, confirming we understood the annulment would void our marriage from inception. We confirmed. He granted the annulment immediately, declaring our marriage legally null and void as if it had never existed. We walked out of the courthouse no longer married, legally strangers again after 6 years together. Claire and I maintained contact in the months following the annulment, trying to navigate what a sibling relationship looked like when you'd been married first. It was awkward and painful, and sometimes we went weeks without speaking because the grief was too heavy. But we tried because we genuinely cared about each other, and that care didn't disappear just because the form of our relationship had to change. We met for coffee occasionally, updated each other on our lives, avoided discussing dating or romance. Slowly, carefully, We built something new from the wreckage of what we'd lost. My relationship with Richard deteriorated completely. He tried to maintain contact, calling and texting and asking to meet, but I couldn't get past the anger and betrayal. Whether or not he'd known about my paternity, he'd raised me with emotional distance that now felt like rejection. I'd spent my whole life trying to win approval from a man who wasn't my biological father and might have unconsciously resented me for being proof of his wife's infidelity. I didn't owe him a relationship, and I chose not to have one. We exchanged cards on birthdays and holidays, but nothing more. My relationship with my mother ended entirely. I couldn't forgive her choices or her continued self-justification. She sent me long emails explaining her reasoning, apologizing but always with caveats about how difficult her situation had been, how young and scared she'd been, how she'd done the best she could. I read the first few, then started deleting them unread. She'd made her choices, and I'd made mine. She'd lost her son by choosing to build his life on lies. That was consequences, finally catching up after 28 years. A year after the annulment, Claire called to tell me she was seeing someone seriously, a man she'd met through work who knew her full story and accepted it. She sounded happy but nervous telling me, worried how I'd react. I was genuinely glad for her, told her she deserved happiness and healing, meant it sincerely. 2 months later, I started dating someone as well, a woman named Rebecca, who worked as a therapist and had her own history with family trauma. We bonded over our shared understanding that families could be sources of deep pain rather than support. Neither relationship was simple or uncomplicated, but we were both trying to build new lives from the pieces of our destroyed ones. The legal reforms we'd hoped to inspire didn't materialize on any grand scale, but there were small changes. Several states introduced legislation requiring genetic counseling information be provided with marriage licenses. Online genetic testing companies updated their consent forms to include warnings about potential family secrets. A few family law firms started offering genetic verification services for couples with any doubts about family histories. It wasn't the systemic change I'd wanted, but it was something. I changed careers 6 months after the annulment, leaving city planning to work for a nonprofit focused on genetic disease awareness and testing accessibility. The work felt meaningful in ways my previous career never had, like I was transforming personal tragedy into public good. Claire eventually went back to school for a master's degree in genetic counseling, inspired by her own experience to help others navigate similar revelations. We'd both been fundamentally changed by what had happened, reshaped by trauma into different people with different priorities. On what would have been our 5th wedding anniversary, Claire and I met at the vineyard where we'd gotten married. We stood looking at the grounds where we'd promised forever to each other, where our families had smiled and celebrated and hidden their secrets. Neither of us cried. We'd done enough crying. Instead, we talked about how far we'd come, how we'd survived something that should have destroyed us completely, how we'd chosen to build meaning from pain. Before we left, Claire said something that felt true and important. We were victims of their lies, but we don't have to stay victims. We survived. We're still here. That's its own kind of justice. I thought about her words driving home that evening, watching the sun set over Ohio farmland. She was right. Our parents had taken many things from us: our marriage, our innocence, our trust, our ability to have biological children together. But they hadn't destroyed us. We'd faced the worst kind of betrayal and survived it, rebuilt ourselves into stronger people, refused to let their shame become ours. That was victory, however small and hard-won. The genetic test results still sat in a folder in my desk drawer, that thin manila envelope that had detonated everything. Sometimes I pulled it out and reread the clinical language describing the coefficient of relationship, the shared DNA markers, the half-sibling determination. The pain had dulled from acute agony to chronic ache, manageable if never fully gone. I'd learned to carry it the way you carry any permanent loss, integrated into who you are, rather than something separate that can be set down. 2 years after the annulment, I received a letter forwarded from Nina Castellano's office. It was from my biological father, Michael Reeves's estate attorney, informing me that Diane had recently shared my existence with them while settling some final family matters. Michael had died 15 years ago, so I'd never have the chance to meet him or demand answers about why he'd abandoned me. But his estate included a trust fund he'd apparently set up years ago, with instructions to distribute to any biological children upon discovery. The amount was substantial, nearly $200,000 with accumulated interest. Blood money, I thought bitterly. Payment for a father's absence and a lifetime of lies. I donated the entire amount to a genetic research foundation studying hereditary diseases, designating it specifically for research into counseling families dealing with unexpected DNA revelations. It felt right to transform Michael Reeves's guilt money into something that might help others avoid our situation. The foundation sent me a thank you letter and put my name on a donor wall. I never visited to see it. Claire eventually married the man she'd been dating, a quiet ceremony with just close friends and Lauren in attendance. She invited me and I went, watched her promise forever to someone new, felt genuinely happy for her healing and moving forward. She'd told him everything before they got engaged, insisted on genetic testing to confirm no biological relationship, taken every precaution to ensure she'd never unknowingly commit incest again. The trauma had made her hypervigilant, but also stronger. She deserved the happiness she'd found. I proposed to Rebecca on a beach in California. 2.5 years after my annulment, We got married in a courthouse ceremony with just 2 witnesses, and we built a life together based on radical honesty and 0 secrets. We decided not to have biological children, partly because of my complicated feelings about genetics, and partly because we both preferred to adopt. We fostered 2 siblings for a year before their adoption finalized, giving children who'd been betrayed by their biological families a chance at a chosen family instead. It felt like closing a circle. Sometimes I still dreamed about the moment in Dr. Huang's office when the genetic test results destroyed everything. In the dreams, I could change the outcome, could choose not to take the test, or find out the truth differently, or prevent the whole situation somehow. But I always woke up to the same reality. The marriage had been void, the love had been real but wrong, the families had been built on lies, and I'd survived it anyway. The dreams were just grief working itself out in sleep. 3 years after everything fell apart, I ran into my mother at a grocery store in Columbus. We locked eyes across the produce section, and I watched her face cycle through hope and fear and resignation. I nodded acknowledgement and kept walking. We had nothing to say to each other that mattered anymore. She'd made her choices 28 years ago, and I'd made mine now. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Some betrayals, once revealed, can't be forgiven. That was truth, finally, after a lifetime of lies. I told myself the story sometimes when the pain felt overwhelming. I'd loved someone completely and genuinely. I'd discovered that love was built on biological impossibility. I'd lost the person I wanted to spend my life with, the identity I thought I had, the family I thought I knew. I'd faced public humiliation and private grief and systematic injustice, and I'd survived it, rebuilt myself, found meaning in the wreckage, helped create change that might prevent others from suffering the same fate. Chosen love again, despite the risk of betrayal. That survival, that resilience, that refusal to let their secrets destroy me permanently was the only justice I'd ever get. And someday, maybe, it would be enough. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.